Hello and welcome back. We're now in part two of our presentation on ideology, where we will be talking about definitions of ideology. Now, I think one thing that I want to start with is by contrasting the definitions that I'm about to give you, coming from the research literature, with some of the most popular and widely used definitions of ideology, the kind that are used in everyday conversation. And probably the first of those is the use of ideology to indicate a political orientation. If you've taken one of those quizzes to identify your ideology, it will tell you whether you're right or left or authoritarian or populist and place you on a grid. That's one popular implicit definition. There is another popular implicit definition, and that is of ideology as false consciousness, if you want to put it that way. That is, ideology is defined implicitly there as the bad things that somebody else thinks. And I say implicit because the implication there is that the person who says it says, I have facts and reason and you have ideology. These definitions are fine, and you're going to find that they share some grounds with the definition that we're going to be going over. But I think we can nail this down with a little bit more precision if we go into a bit more detail. So let's begin with the first type of definition. And this is the broadest type of definition, the taxonomic definition of ideology. It was what I hinted at a moment ago when I was talking about taking the quiz to place yourself ideologically and so on. You saw this in the literature in the article by Hamilton, who gives the 27 different definitions. Now, in this approach, ideologies are defined as comprehensive and encompassing systems of thought or systems of belief or systems of representation, what we might call symbolic systems. And the implication here, it's a non-evaluative implication. It's meant to be more descriptive than anything else. The implication is that public discourse is made up of some number, we don't know how many, of isms that are in dialogue or in conflict or in some kind of relation with one another. So this is an approach that can be useful for making comparisons, not very useful for doing evaluation. The main implication here is that it's possible to study ideology in a way that might have some comparative elements, but is basically neutral. The second major type of definition that I want to bring up is the functionalist definition. And remember, functionalism is an approach in sociology that tries to define what something is by what it does. That is, to identify its function. And in the functionalist definition, the function of ideology, what it does, is to bring members of society together. So ideology is constructed as constituting in some way the center of the society. And I think there's an implication here that is obvious. That is that this is a position that tends to favor certain types of ideology. It tends to favor state building projects, that is, projects designed to create a sort of consensus. It is a position that tends to promote ideology as a form of coordination of the society, of building a level of uniformity in society. So there's a postulate there that there has to be some level of consensus of uniformity in order for the society to function, a certain baseline of shared values or shared beliefs or shared symbols. And in that sense, the functionalist approach is conservative in character, that is, that it tends to privilege ideas that are already existing in the social environment and to try to encourage them because they have a certain unifying power. I mean, religion is probably the basic model for this functionalist definition of ideology, in the sense that one of the postulates of religion, of the organization of religion, is that everybody should share some similar conceptions on really fundamental areas of human life. What constitutes good and evil? What constitutes right and wrong? And I've used religion as an example, but this is a definition that makes its way into law, for example. So in law, an insane person, that is somebody who cannot be held accountable for a crime, is defined as a person who cannot distinguish between right or wrong. That is, what makes a person insane, according to law, is their absence of participation in this ideological construction. So what sort of analysis and what sort of critique would you be likely to do using a functionalist definition? I would say that because of the centrality that it gives to shared ideas and to some level of uniformity, this is a definition that encourages critiques of society as becoming more fragmented, being more divided, having crises of identity, that sort of thing. I mean, I would also say a weak implication of the functionalist definition is that ideally there is only one ideology. Now, let's move to another type so that you can see some differences. If we look at an historicist definition, okay, the historicist definition sees ideology as grounded in history and as structured by circumstances, social and political circumstances, and relations of inequality at any particular moment. One way of looking at this, and this is a system that was derived from the thinking of Marx, but elaborated much more by more recent thinkers, people like Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, is to talk about three different types of ideology. So the central type of ideology, the most important one, the one that is going to structure most interaction and most discourse in any social environment, is the dominant ideology. But there is not only a dominant ideology at any historical moment, there is also a latent ideology, that is ideas that have survived from a past social order that is no longer in power or no longer exists, and there is an emergent ideology, that is the ideas that will structure the new relations of power that will emerge, or that people hope will emerge, after the one that is currently in existence stops being dominant. So if we want to take a sort of crude interpretation of that, Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall were both heavily influenced by Marx. They would look at capitalism and capitalist ideologies as being dominant. There are also latent ideologies of patrimonialism, derived from feudalism and religion, and the emergent ideology, which would be the ideology of what they at least hoped would be the anti-capitalist revolution. Now, what makes the dominant ideology dominant is the fact that it reflects the social relations that are in existence at the time that it is dominant. And this is what I mean to imply. You see, as the second point here, a long quotation from Karl Marx in the German Ideology. I'm not going to read this whole quotation out to you. You can read it yourself in your free time. What I want to draw your attention to is just one term that is used in this quotation, and that is the term camera obscura. Okay, what he is trying to get at is the sense that the ideas, the dominant ideas in any period, reflect the dominant relations of power and inequality. And camera obscura, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the term. Literally, it means dark room, but it is a device. It's a device that predates photography. When I was a kid in junior high school many years ago, they taught us in photography class how pictures are made, and we made a camera obscura. We took one of those big tubs of ice cream, poked a hole on one side, hung a piece of photo paper on the other side, and you open the hole, and an image is produced, a negative image on the photo paper. The camera obscura was like this. What it does is it brings the light in through a hole into a room and projects an image of what is outside. But what's interesting about the image is that it is negative, it is backward, and it is upside down. So this is the image of ideology in in this definition. So one way of thinking about it, for example, is that there are real relations of inequality in any society, right? Sometimes we picture these as a pyramid. There is a very small dominant group at the top, a group subservient to them underneath that, a somewhat larger middle class or class of craftspeople, employees, and so on, a much larger group of people who are subjected to them, right? Unequal relations of power represented as a pyramid. The way this is represented as backward and upside down in ideology is, for example, in religious systems that put a god at the top and angels and some clerics to intercede, and at the bottom a great mass of people. So in a way, this promotes an understanding of religion that sees it as a reflection of the inequalities that exist in the social environment that people experience day to day, except it also makes it appear to be justified and divine and beautiful and an object of worship. Another element of this camera obscura idea is that the only thing that can be projected as the image, that is, the assumption is the only ideas that can be created, are ideas with which people actually have experience, right? That's what Marx means when he says consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. Let's try to come up with a practical application of this. Let's talk about science fiction. We all know science fiction, right? Popular in novels and in films. And the thing about science fiction is, on the one hand, it's a field of production where imagination runs free, right? You imagine people in spaceships racing between different planets and all kinds of fabulous machines and wondrous kinds of life living in other parts of the universe and so on. But one science fiction writer and theorist, Joanna Russ, points out that in science fiction you can see the writers are capable of imagining all kinds of different technologies, but what they cannot imagine is different ways for human beings to relate to one another. So in all of these wondrous spaceships with their flashing lights and lasers and heaven knows what else is in science fiction, the relations between men and women, the kinds of families and domestic environments in which people live are the same as the ones in the environment where the writers are writing. So we can imagine all kinds of wondrous things, but the thing that is impossible to imagine because of the power of ideology is different ways of humans relating to one another, because that is the foundation of the social order grounded in inequality. Let me move on to another type of definition, and that is what we can call the critical definition. It's one that I alluded to at the beginning of ideology as false consciousness. And in this view, ideology is defined as, and then there's only one ideology at any social moment, a set of relations that justifies inequalities in power as they exist, and that portrays them as being natural, as inevitable, as beautiful, as inescapable. Right? Thompson, in his article, defines this type of ideology. The phrase that he uses is meaning in the service of power. What are some examples of this? We can think, for example, about the way in which capitalism is defended by calling upon ideas of human nature. The argument is that this is a system of economic activity that is most consistent with the way that human beings are, and then presents the postulates as absolute truths that people are self-seeking, greedy, competitive, whatever other thing. A similar sort of argument would be the argument that's made against equality of genders, that either inequality is something that is mandated through a kind of religious idea, or making a biological argument that people of different genders have different capacities, and that inequality corresponds to these different capacities. Now, Roland Barthes is the name that is probably most strongly associated with elaborating this idea of ideology as a form of dominance. And he sees it as a war of intelligence, that this is a type of ideology that tells you not to think. It tells you that all of the answers are already given. And the common thread that he finds in all these types of ideology is false consciousness. It's indicated in the quotation that I've got there in the second point on the slide, is that the war is always waged in the name of common sense. It's an understanding If you disagree, it's not just that you're wrong, it's that you fundamentally don't get it. And that's the appeal of the common sense argument. And finally, let me give you the broadest possible definition. And this is close to the taxonomic definition, but it tells more about what might be functions of ideology. This is derived from Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, in his lectures on logic. He says, every ideological approach, every grand understanding of the world, gives answers to the following four questions. It answers the question, what can I know? It answers the question, what should I do? The question, what can I hope for? And the question, what are humans? What are people? That is, they have an idea of human nature, they have an idea of the limits of knowledge, of obligation, and of history. And this is a definition. I mean, it's helpful in the sense that it gives you a way of approaching any kind of ideology and identifying its base elements. I said it's the broadest possible definition because it's one of those definitions that, while not untrue, is so broad that it excludes nothing. So these are the basic types of approaches to ideology. I'm going to move more into functions in the next section, which I'll begin recording in a minute when I'm done recording this.